Welcome, everyone. Today we'll begin the part one of our study of Bitter's Theory and Practice of Couples and Family Counseling, the third edition, published in 2021 by the American Counseling Association, ACA. Over the next several sessions, we will go through chapters 1 to 3, which lay the conceptual and personal foundation for everything that follows in this course. Chapter 1 introduces the systems perspective and the key theoretical architecture, including bioecological theory, that frames this entire text. Chapter 2 traces the historical development of the field through 4 interlocking genograms of counseling and family counseling, or couples counseling. And Chapter 3 turns the lens on you, the developing practitioner, and asks what personal work is required of anyone who hopes to do this kind of relational practice as well. So by the end of this session today, you should be able to articulate why family counseling represents a fundamentally different epistemological stance from individual counseling, so tracing the 4 major historical lineages of the field, and begin to examine the ways your own family of origin has been shaped and will continue to shape your clinical practice. All right, so before we dive in, let me orient you to the arc of these 3 chapters, because they'll build on each other in a deliberate sequence. Chapter 1 is kind of that entry point. Bitter opens by inviting you into the system's perspective, which, as he acknowledges, runs directly counter to the Western cultural values most of us have been steeped into. If you were trained first in individual counseling, as a lot of us were, this chapter may feel like being asked to see in an entirely new direction or new language, and that could be disorienting, and that's kind of intentional and highly productive for the work that we're going to be going through. So Chapter 2 then situates us historically. Bitter uses the device of a genogram, but not a family, but of rather the profession itself, to show us who influenced whom, what paradigm shifts occurred, and why the field looks the way that it does today. History is not background material here. It's a clinical tool. Understanding where these ideas came from helps us hold them with appropriate critical distance. Chapter 3 is probably the most personal of the 3. It takes everything we've been learning about family systems and applies it directly to us. So your family of origin, your communication patterns, your level of differentiation. Bitter draws heavily on 10 years of training with Virginia Satir to offer experiential processes that help practitioners discover self in the family context. So this is not a soft prelude to the real work. It truly is the real work. All right, so the core premise. Um, Bitter opens the chapter with a claim that is worth sitting on, probably for a while. Couples and family practice is fundamentally different from individual counseling, as I previously mentioned. Not just more complex, not just bigger in scale, but fundamentally different. So epistemologically, methodologically, and ethically. What makes it different? When you see an individual client, you are betting that the 1 hour of influence you have each week will be greater than all of the systemic influences and the rest of that person's life. So Bitter quotes Gerald Corey's case of Anne to make this point concrete. The individual counselor focuses on Anne's diagnosis, her coping, her internal processes, and the systemic counselor invites Anne's entire family into the room because, as Corey writes, a family's systemic affiliations and interactions, they have more power in a person's life than a single counselor could ever have hoped to have. So that's sobering and a liberating claim, like both at the same time here. Sobering because it challenges the fantasy that the individually heroic therapist of the heroic therapist. Liberating because it means we don't have to carry the whole clinical burden alone. The system we're working with carries much of it for us if we engage in it properly. So a little bit of individual versus systemic approaches. The comparison and contrasting here. Bitter gives us useful contrast table. The individual counselor focuses on obtaining an accurate diagnosis, beginning counseling with Anne alone, exploring causes and cognitive and behavioral processes, and intervening to help Anne cope. The systemic counselor, by contrast, explores the system, uses a genogram, invites family members, focuses on the relational patterns within which Anne's depression makes systemic sense. Notice that the phrase makes systemic sense. The systemic counselor is not asking whether Anne is sick. The systemic counselor is asking what function does the symptom serve in this particular relational field. Thinking of Adlerian's focus on the teleological. Adler focused a lot on meaning and purpose and how we're innately designed for both of those categories, or if you think of them the same way. So for reasons the system's perspective matters. So Bitter offers 4 pillars of justification for thinking systemically. And I want to highlight each one of them kind of briefly here. So first, social embeddedness. We are born into families. Most of us spend our lives in one form of family or another, whether that be nuclear, blended, chosen, or extended. Families and systems are where individuals discover who they are. This is not a sentimental observation. It's a clinical and developmental fact. Second, multiplied influence. As we just heard from Corey, systemic affiliations have more clinical leverage than any individual therapist. When change is enacted within the system, it is reinforced by the very relationships in which the person actually lives. Third, sustained change. Systemic interventions increase the probability that change will be maintained because it's embedded in the relational fabric of daily life, not dependent on a weekly contact with a single professional. So, and fourth, perhaps the most philosophically important, circular causality. So Bateson in 1972 argued that in human systems, we cannot think in a linear cause and effect terms. So like A causes B, which causes C, and so on and so forth, which curves back and then influences A again. There's no first cause, no single villain, no simple origin point for a family's difficulties. And that shifts the entire orientation of our clinical work. So away from blame and towards process. All right, so Broff and Brenner's ecological framework and kind of why this matters. So this is looking very very specifically at parts and also very broadly all at the same time, all with an interwoven chronosphere or time awareness. To understand how the systems operate in a person's life, Bitter draws on the psychologist Uri Bronfenbrenner, whose bioecological system theory gives us the map that's nested in environment. So what Bronfenbrenner called the ecological system of the individual. Bronfenbrenner identified 5 such systems, and I want to walk through each one because together they constitute the clinical context in which every family we will ever work with is embedded. So, starting with that microsystem, the microsystem is the immediate environment, the family, school, neighborhood, religious community, peer group, and even the individual's own biology. This is where direct daily contact occurs. For children especially, the family microsystem is the most formative developmental context. So moving on to the mesosystem. The mesosystem captures what happens when microsystems interact. What happens to the child when the parent and the school systems come into conflict? When the peers' group norms contradict the family's values, the mesosystem is the interface between the systems, and it's a rich clinical territory. And for the exosystem involves systems that do not directly include the person, but nonetheless affect their development. So Bitter gives us a vivid example of a mother that receives a promotion requiring more travel. The father becomes unhappy, stay-at-home parent. Conflict between the couple increases, and both parents change their patterns of interaction with the child. The child's development is affected by the mother's workplace, even though the child was never in the workplace. So then that leads us into the macrosystem. The macrosystem encompasses the broader cultural, political, economic, and social forces that shape all family life. Race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, religion, national origin. When we ask how race or patriarchy or immigration statuses shape a family's experience, we are working at the level of the macrosystem, which brings us to the chronosystem. Finally, the chronosystem tracks the dimension of time, the pattern of events and transition over life's course. This is why genograms are so valuable. They let us map the chronosystem across multiple generations, tracking how historical events, losses, migrations, and transitions have shaped the family's current functioning. So what Broff and Brenner gave us in this framework that prevents us from ever looking at a family in isolation. Every family we see is simultaneously in a microsystem, embedded in a mesosystem, embedded in an exosystem, embedded in a macrosystem, all unfolding over historical time. That is what it means to think ecologically. Redefining normal. So, one of the most important contributions Bitter makes in Chapter 1 is to challenge the idea of the normal family, and to do so not as an ideological gesture, but as a clinical necessity. So, drawing on Forma Walsh's landmark work, he notes that the normal families are not problem free. That statistical averages are a poor way to define normal, and that socially constructed ideals of the healthy family life have real, measurable negative effects on actual families. Walsh offers a functional language as an alternative to charged words healthy and normal. Functional describes families' purpose or processes that successfully meet developmental demands, manage normative and non-normative stressors, and help families reach their shared goals. Um, Dysfunctional. So Walsh is explicit about this as referring to specific patterns, not the whole family. We label the pattern, we don't label the family. So contemporary family statistics here. Bitter walks us through a sobering set of contemporary stats, and I want to pause on a few of them because they directly shape the clinical populations we will encounter. So only about half of adults are currently married, down from 70% in 1960. 1 in 4 households is headed by a single parent, 85% of whom are women. 40% of children are born outside of the marriage. Two-thirds of two-parent households are dual earner families. The divorce rate has hovered around 45%. Most divorced people remarry, and 60% of those remarriages also fail. So two findings deserve particular clinical attention here. First, the 2 decades of research have now demonstrated that children raised by gay or lesbian parents develop comparably to children raised by heterosexual parents. In some respects, such as equitable household division and parental involvement, lesbian parented families show strengths that exceed heterosexual norms. Second, immigrant families often demonstrate greater resiliency in the face of challenges that native-born families, a finding that directly challenges the deficit narratives that often surround immigrant communities. We're also looking at resiliency practice here. So this brings us to one of the most important clinical orientations in contemporary family counseling, is that resiliency practice. So rather than entering a family looking for pathology, resiliency-focused counselors start by noticing the strengths the family has already demonstrated under stress. They assume that no single approach to healthy functioning fits all families. They interview the couple or the family as experts in finding their own solutions. And they orient toward optimism, courage, possibilities, flexibility, connectedness, and internal as well as external resources. So this is not naive optimism. It is a deliberate clinical reframe, grounded in decades of resilience research that fundamentally changes the collaborative dynamic between the counselor and the family. All right, so Chapter 2, the 4 interlocking histories of the profession. Chapter 2 is organized around a remarkable device. Bitter presents 4 genograms of the field of couples and family counseling itself. Just as we use genograms to trace relational patterns across 3 generations of a family, Bitter uses them to trace the intellectual and professional lineages of the discipline. There are 4 of these genograms, each capturing a distinct era and paradigm. Let me briefly orient you to each one before we explore them in depth here. History 1, it covers the systemic pioneers of their offspring. So from Sigmund Freud through Alfred Adler, Rudolf Dreikurs, through Nathan Ackerman, Murray Bowen, Carl Whitaker, and Virginia Satir, and including Lynn Hoffman, one of the most developmentally dynamic figures in the profession's history. So History 2 traces the structural, strategic, and solution-focused models that dominated the 1970s, 1980s, and the early 90s. Salvador Minuchin's structural model, Jay Haley, the MRI Group, and the Milan team's strategic approaches, and Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg's solution-focused therapy as the bridge to postmodern practice. History 3 documents the postmodern turn. So Harleen Anderson, Harold Gulishane's collaborative linguistic approach, Michael White and David Epstone's narrative therapy, Tom Anderson's reflecting teams, and the feminist critique that permanently shaped or reshaped the field's assumptions about gender, power, and neutrality. And History 4 brings us to the evidence-based present. So the cognitive behavioral family therapy in tradition of Ellis, Beck, and Dattilo, and the three major couples counseling models that dominate the field today. So we're looking at the Gottman's Sound Relationship House, Susan Johnson's Emotionally Focused Therapy, and Harville Hendricks and Helen Hunt's Imago approach. So what matters about this historical framework is not memorizing names and dates, rather. What matters is understanding that every theory you encounter in the course emerged from a specific intellectual tradition, a specific set of questions, a specific historical moment, and that understanding that context is essential to in using these models with clinical integrity. So we're starting off with Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939. So obviously, we begin inevitably with Sigmund Freud. Freud brought to psychology a new appreciation for the unconscious processes in human nature and a methodology for assessing the unconscious in clinical work. The Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, which began meeting at Freud's home in 1906, was the first formal gathering of what would become modern psychotherapy. But here's the critical point. Freud was not a family counselor. His focus was fundamentally intrapsychic, on the individual mind, not on the relational system. He came closest to family work in the famous case of Little Hans, where he coached a father on working with his son's phobia. But there's no evidence that Freud ever sat with a family in the way that we understand family counseling today. Brings us to Alfred Adler, 1870 to 1937. And this is where Alfred Adler becomes critically important and frankly underappreciated in the most family counseling textbooks. So Adler was Freud's contemporary and one-time associate, but their approaches diverged fundamentally. While Freud focused on the intrapsychic, Adler focused on the social. Adler called his approach individual psychology, but by individual, he meant the whole person. Indivisible, embedded in social context. He introduced concepts that we now take for granted as systemic: the family constellation, family atmosphere, birth order, and social embeddedness. And crucially, he was the first psychologist to actually conduct family counseling sessions, doing so in an open forum format before parents, teachers, and community members in more than 30 child guidance clinics in Vienna after World War I. Adler was systemic before systems theory existed as a language. Adler also gave us what he called a psychology of use rather than possession. People do not have symptoms, they use them. A symptom serves a purpose within the person's social context. The teleological, purposeful understanding of behavior is a fundamental systemic insight. So that brings us to Dreikurs here. Dreikurs was Adler's student, and after Adler's death in 1937, his greatest systematizer. Dreikurs brought Adlerian family counseling to the United States, opened the Alfred Adler Institute in Chicago in 1954, and developed the Open Forum Family Education Center model that would train generations of practitioners, including Ray Lowe, Manfred Sonsgaard, Oscar Christensen, and ultimately Jim Bitter himself. Dreikurs gave us 4 goals of children's misbehavior: attention, power, revenge, and assumed disability. And the clinical technique of goal disclosure, which produced what he called a recognition reflex in children: a quick smile and a twinkle in the eye when their goal was accurately reflected back to them. So here we have some key concepts of Murray Bowen and the multi-generational family theory. So Murray Bowen is arguably the most theoretically systematic of all the family therapy pioneers. Where others developed techniques, Bowen developed a complete theory of family emotional process, one that he was grounded in evolutionary biology and natural systems. His core concepts have become the lingua franca of family counseling, regardless of one's theoretical orientation. Differentiation of the self. Um, so the cornerstone of Bowen's theory is differentiation of the self. The capacity to maintain a distinct psychological identity while remaining in genuine emotional contact with others. Differentiated individuals can choose to be grounded by their thinking rather than swept away by their emotional reactivity. Undifferentiated people fuse with the dominant emotional pattern of the family. They have what Bowen called a pseudo-self, positions they hold only as long as the relational environment supports them. Notice the clinical implication here. The therapist's own level of differentiation is not peripheral to the work. It is central. The less differentiated the therapist, the more likely they are able to be pulled away into the family's emotional process. What Bowen called the undifferentiated family ego mass. This is why Bowen required his trainees to work on their families of origin as a part of their professional development. And we move on to triangulation. When tension between two people becomes intolerable, the anxious pair tends to draw in a third person, a child, a relative, even a therapist, to stabilize the system. This is triangulation. The third person functions as a stabilizer, but at the cost of their own differentiation. And when the third is a child, a cost to the child's development. Detriangulation, learning to remain in non-anxious contact with both parties without getting pulled in, is central to the clinical goal. Which brings us to the multi-generational transmission. So the Bowen's model was the first to articulate clearly that the family patterns pass across generations. The family emotional process transmits levels of differentiation, patterns of triangulation, and ways of managing anxiety from one generation to the next. This is not just metaphorical. It is a clinical fact, observable in carefree three-generational genogram work. Which then, sum it all up, looking at this career trajectory. Bowen's clinical career moved from the Meninier Clinic through the National Institute of Mental Health, where he hospitalized entire families of schizophrenic patients for research purposes, to Georgetown University, where he developed his model and trained the next generation of family counselors. The training program produced Philip Guerin, Thomas Fogarty, Betty Carter, and Monica McGoldrick, each of whom made independent landmark contributions to the field. McGoldrick developed the genograms and her integration of race, culture, and gender into family practice. This represents some of the most enduring contributions to the field's history. All right, so we come to Virginia Satir and Lynn Hoffman. So Virginia Satir is, in Bitter's own words, one of the greatest teachers he has ever met. And after 10 years of training with her process communities, that is not a casual statement. Satir was one of the first women to develop a complete model of family therapy, and her emphasis on self-esteem, congruent communication, and authentic human contact brought something to the family counseling that most of the men in the field were not offering: warmth, nurturance, and unapologetic belief in the worth of every person in the room. Her foundational text, Conjoint Family Therapy, published in 1964, established many of the communication concepts that we now permeate in the field. Her book, People Making, was eventually published in 27 languages, a measure of how broadly her humanistic message resonated across cultures. The Avanta network she founded brought together family practitioners from around the world in annual gatherings and month-long process communities. In a comparative study, Joan Winter, the Satir model, had the highest family engagement rate of any approach tested, over 90%, and was the most effective at building self-esteem and maintaining therapeutic contact through termination. This is not a minor finding for a field that often struggles with attrition. Excuse me. Satir's experiential interventions, sculpting parties, family reconstruction, the human mandala, were not techniques in the conventional sense. They were embedded relational processes designed to make what is usually invisible in a family. The patterns of distance, closeness, power, and fear literally visible in the room. Which brings us to Lynn Hoffman. Lynn Hoffman represents one of the most intellectually mobile trajectories in the history of family counseling. She began as a collaborator with Jay Haley at MRI, working with strategic model. She then moved to Ackerman Institute in New York, where she worked with Peggy Papp and Olga Silverstein on the Brief Therapy Project. Using paradoxical, strategic interventions, over time she became increasingly uncomfortable with the power dynamics implicit in strategic manipulation, even benevolently intended manipulation, and she evolved towards a postmodern collaborative approach influenced by Harold Gulishin, Harleen Anderson, and Tom Anderson's work with reflecting teams. So Hoffman wrote her way through each of these transitions, producing scholarships that documented not just what she was doing, but why she was changing. She is a model of intellectual honesty and developmental courage that the field would do well to honor more explicitly. And onto the structural family therapy. Um, Salvador Minuchin. So Salvador Minuchin is one of the most charismatic and clinically directed figures in history of family counseling. His structural model emerged from work within delinquent boys from poor families at the Wiltwyck School in New York, a population that individual therapy had largely failed. Minuchin recognized that families of these boys had organizational problems that talk therapy alone could not address. Boundaries were either too diffuse, what he called enmeshment, or too rigid, what he called disengagement. In both cases, the parental subsystem could not provide effective leadership. So the structural therapy is therapy of action. The counselor joins the family, accommodating to its style, following its emotional themes, entering its structure, and then from within the joined position, enacts change. The primary vehicle is enactment. The counselor directs the family to demonstrate its problematic pattern in the session. By watching and experiencing the live pattern, the counselor can interrupt it, amplify it, or reconstruct it in real time. Change happens through experience, not primarily through insight. So the MRI strategy therapy, Bateson, Jackson, Haley, at roughly about the same time on the West Coast, a very different kind of family work was developing at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto, California. Gregory Bateson, anthropologist married to Margaret Mead, brought his interest in cybernetics and communication systems to a group of practitioners that included Don Jackson, Jay Haley, and John Weakland. Their foundational insight was the double bind, a no-win, no-escape communication pattern hypothesized as contributing to schizophrenic processes in family systems. The strategic model that developed from this work understood problems as maintained by the very attempted solutions people applied to them. Haley's directive style, his use of paradox and ordeals borrowed from Milton Erickson hypnotherapy, and the Milan team's circular questioning and invariant prescription all shared a common clinical logic. Disrupt the problem maintaining pattern through strategic, often indirect intervention. The problem is the problem, and when the problem is solved, counseling ends. So then going into the solution-focused therapy. Steve Deshazier and Insoo Kim Berg took the strategic model's problem focus and turned it completely on its head. Working from Brief Family Therapy Center in Milwaukee, they asked, instead of focusing on the problem and how it is maintained, what if we focused entirely on the solution and how it might be constructed? Their miracle question. Exception questions and scaling questions became the vocabulary of a new approach that declared the end of resistance, positioned the client as the expert on their own solutions, and built a bridge from the modernistic strategic tradition into postmodern collaborative approaches that would follow. All right, sorry, now I'm actually onto this screen's content. So the social constructionism, Anderson and Gulishian, by the 1990s, a fundamental epistemological shift was underway in family counseling. The postmodern perspective challenged the very idea that a therapist or anyone could know a family from the outside in an objective way. If knowing is always perspectival, always co-constructed in a language and relationship, then the therapist is never a neutral observer. They are always a participant in the construction of the family's reality. Harleen Anderson and Harold Gulshine at the Houston Galveston Institute developed what they called a not-knowing position, characterized by genuine curiosity, interest, and fascination rather than professional certainty. They asked what they called the most interesting question, keeping the therapeutic conversation open and evolving, rather than driving towards predetermined conclusions. Excuse me. Michael Folcott's analysis of power is essential context here. Folcott argued that what we could call knowledge is never neutral. It is always embedded in power relations. Dominant knowledge positions maintain themselves by silencing alternative stories. And in psychotherapy, the DSM and the professional clinician's interpretive authority are powerful examples of this dynamic. Now, walking onto narrative therapy, White and Epstein. Michael White in Australia, and David Epstein in New Zealand took these ideas and built one of the most clinically creative models in history of family counseling. Their central insight was that people often live inside problem-saturated stories, narratives in which the problem has fused with their identity. White Epstein developed the technique of externalizing, separating the problem from the person. The problem is the problem. The person is not the problem. The linguistic and relational move opens space for the person to take a stand against the problem's influence in their life. From that position, the counselor and the client can together identify unique events, moments when the person resisted the problem's dominance, and those as the foundation for reauthoring, building a new, preferable story of competence and resilience, reflecting teams, therapeutic letters, certificates, and definitional ceremonies extend this reauthoring beyond the session. Now moving on to the feminist critique. In 1978, Rachel Hare Mustin fired what Bitters calls the first feminist arrow across the bow of the family counseling, naming and exposing the sexism inherent in the family systems model. Over the 2 decades, feminist practitioners including Monica McGoldrick, Betty Carter, Peggy Papp, and Olga Silverstein, who formed the Women's Project following the 1984 Stonehenge Conference, argued persistently and effectively that the field could not claim to be neutral while ignoring the profound power inequalities that structured family life. Today, the feminist critique is no longer debated. It has been absorbed into the field's foundational assumptions. Race, gender, class, and sexual orientations are not optional lenses in family counseling. They are ethical requirements of responsible practice. So, cybernetics, feedback, and systems theory. So, before we even move on to Chapter 3, I want to consolidate the key theoretical concepts from Chapter 2, particularly the systems language derived from cybernetics, because these terms will reoccur throughout every theory chapter that follows. So, cybernetics. Gregory Bateson, 1972, adopted the term cybernetics from the mathematician Norbert Wiener, who had applied it to mechanical systems and the development of computers. Bateson saw that the same principles of self-regulation and feedback could be applied to human communication and family process. Cybernetics is the science of communication in systems, how systems maintain stability, regulate themselves, and respond to change. Circular causality. So in a linear model, A causes B. In a circular causal model, A causes B, B causes C, C causes D, and D curves back to influence A. Every element in the system acts and is acted on by every other element. That is a profoundly different way of understanding human behavior. It moves us from blame to who started it. To process what pattern is the sequence part of and what purpose does it serve in the system. Going on to feedback loops here. So a positive feedback loop promotes change. It amplifies deviation from the system's current state. A negative feedback loop deters change. It returns the system toward its current equilibrium. These terms carry no moral valence. A negative feedback loop is not bad. It simply maintains homeostasis. In families, negative feedback loops often maintain stable but dysfunctional patterns. Because stability, even painful stability, is predictable, change, even positive change, is uncertain. So over on to first order versus second order cybernetics. When we treat a family as an observable system that we can study from the outside as if we're mechanics looking at an engine, we are operating from first order cybernetic precision, but von Bertalanffy and the postmodern theorist pointed out that this is impossible with living systems. The moment a therapist enters the room, they become part of the system. They influence it. It influences them. This is second order cybernetics. The observer is always already embedded in what they observe. Therapists who do not know this are simply unaware of how they are affecting the family. So the double-bind theory here. Finally, Bateson and his colleagues introduced double-bind theory, the observation that some communication contexts create situations in which the recipient cannot win and cannot escape. Two contradictory injunctions are enforced simultaneously, with no perceived avenue of exit. Bateson's team hypothesized that chronic exposure to such patterns in families contributed to schizophrenic processes. Although the double-bind theory proved inadequate as a complete explanation of schizophrenia, it launched the systemic study of family communication and opened the field of family counseling. So the self in a family context, the foundation of practice. So now we're we're into chapter 3, and I want to be direct about its significance. This is not necessarily a warm-up chapter. This is the background material. Chapter 3 is making a clinical and ethical argument that the practitioner's personhood is the central instrument of change in couples and family counseling, and that means the practitioner must do their own work. Bitter opens with a quote that I think is worth reading carefully, slowly, reflected on. He writes, and this is drawing on McGoldrick's work as well as his own. It's almost axiomatic these days that family practitioners in training must consider the impact that their families of origins had on their personal development. If we do not carry this journey into our own histories, We are in danger of trying to work out our personal family issues with every new family we encounter. The last phrase, working out your personal family issues with every new family, is not merely a metaphor. It is a clinical observation about what actually happens when the untrained practitioner encounters a family pattern that activates unresolved material from their own history. They triangulate, they take sides, they avoid certain conversations, they get inducted into roles that mirror their family of origin. None of this is conscious. All of it affects the family. So, family of origin exploration here. Bitter asks practitioners to examine their own family history, the patterns, roles, loyalties, and wounds, not as a therapeutic exercise for its own sake, but as clinical preparation. You cannot hold a family member's grief without equanimity. If that grief triggers your own unresolved loss, you cannot work with a father's rage without knowing your own experience of parental anger. This is not weakness, it is clinical realism. So, the use of self. Um, Satir taught Bitter, and Bitter teaches us. The practitioner is the instrument of change, not the technique, not the theoretical framework. The person holds the space, who models congruence, who is genuinely present and authentic. That person creates the conditions in which families can risk change. Technical competence matters here, but it follows from personal presence, not the reverse. So, personal and professional development. Bowen was explicit about this. The therapist's level of differentiation of self directly affects clinical effectiveness. A therapist who is poorly differentiated will fuse with the family's emotional system, lose their observational position, and become part of the problem rather than a resource for change. This is why Bowen required his trainees to work on their own families of origins. Not as a prerequisite they could tick off and move past, but as an ongoing practice throughout a professional lifetime. So, scholarship and practice. Doctoral level practitioners engage the research not as external obligation, but as an integral part of reflective practice and theory development. So, like the practitioner-scholar model is not a bifurcation, reading research in one compartment and doing clinical work in another. It is a continuous reflective loop in which the clinical questions generate research interest and research findings that reshape the clinical practice. So on to Virginia Satir's process and self and family discovery. So Bitter trained with Virginia Satir for about 10 years, attending 3 of her month-long process communities, co-authoring work with her, and eventually becoming a past president of Aventa, her training network. Chapter 3 draws deeply on the relationship and the experiential process Satir developed for helping practitioners discover the self and family context. I want to walk through 6 of these processes briefly, because you are likely to encounter them in supervision and in your own training experiences. Family sculpting. Sculpting is embodied, spatial intervention in which family members are physically arranged in relation to each other to externalize relational dynamics, power, distance, closeness, alliance, fear, what is usually invisible in a family. The sense of who is close to whom, who is avoided, what roles are frozen, becomes literally visible when bodies are placed in space. Bunny Dool at the Boston Family Therapy Institute further developed this process, and it remains one of the most powerful experiential tools in the field. Parts parties. Parts parties are a group of process in which participants embody and explore different internal parts of themselves, often contradictory parts that emerge from the family system, roles, and expectations. You might carry a part that learned to please and a part that learned to rebel, part that performs competence and a part that fears failure. Part parties make these internal multiplicities visible and allow for integration. Moving on to family reconstruction. Family reconstruction is an extended dramatic process in which the participant, Satir called them, the star, guides a group reenactment of key family origin scenes. The goal is not catharsis for its own sake, but insight into the multi-generational patterns and the opportunity to grieve unresolved losses and renegotiate historical relational injuries. So communication stances. Satir identified 4 dysfunctional communication stances that people adopt under stress. The placater denies their own needs to keep the peace. The blamer attacks others to avoid vulnerability. The super reasonable person retreats into abstraction and denies all feeling. And the irrelevant person deflects with distraction and humor, denying everything. All 4 are survival strategies developed in families where authentic communication was dangerous. The goal is congruence, authentic, internally consistent expression in which words, body, feelings, and context all align. Now on to the PACE framework. So Bitter's own integrative contribution is what he calls the PACE framework, an acronym for purpose, awareness, contact, and experience. Purposefulness draws on the Adlerian psychology. The sense that counseling has a direction and a meaning, awareness, contact draw on Gestalt practice. Being fully present with what is alive in the moment, and experience draws on Satir, the transformative power of lived therapeutic encounters. Together, these 4 elements give Bitter's practice both structure and spontaneity. So the ingredients of an interaction. Finally, Satir developed a process she called ingredients of an interaction, a way of slowing down and examining every element of a relational exchange: self, other, context, sensory data, meaning making, and response. It's a clinical microscope for examining how communication happens and where it breaks down. So breaking this down into a little bit more further detail, we introduced PACE briefly in the last slide here. Let me unpack it more fully, though, because it represents Bitter's own theoretical synthesis, his attempt to articulate what purposeful, aware relational practice actually looks like in the room. So purpose comes from, as previously mentioned, Adlerian psychology. Adler argued that all human behavior is teleological, oriented toward a goal, moving towards a final cause. In counseling, purpose means that the therapeutic relationship has direction and meaning. The counselor maintains a direction or a sense of where the work is going without being rigidly directive about how it gets there. Purpose gives counseling a backbone without making it mechanical. Awareness comes from the Gestalt practice, specifically from the work of Irving and Miriam Polster, with whom Bitter trained in the 1990s. Awareness means being fully present within what is alive in the moment. What is happening in the room right now, in the body, in the relational field? It is the opposite of the counselor who is thinking 3 questions ahead while the client is speaking. Contact is also a Gestalt concept, genuine directed connection with the other, neither merged, either lost in the other's experience, nor distanced, so protected behind professional objectivity. Satir called this kind of contact an I-thou relationship in Berber sense, 2 people who meet as fully present, irreducible persons rather than as role or function. Experience draws on Satir's conviction that therapeutic change occurs not primarily through insight, the light bulb moment of understanding, but through lived experience in session. Enactment sculpts the reconstructions and the genuine relational encounters create new experiences of self and other that insights alone cannot produce. So, the essential practitioner characteristics here. Chapter 3 also gives us a set of practitioner qualities that Bitter considers essential for relational practice at the doctoral level. I want to read through these because they are worth carrying with you beyond um, just this simple slide here. Congruence in communication, the satiric concept of authentic alignment between what you think, feel, say, and how you hold your body. Authentic presence, the capacity to be genuinely in contact with the family rather than performance or performing competence. A differentiated self, the Bowenian quality of maintaining your identity under the family's emotional pressure. Curiosity, the Adlerian stance of genuine curiosity or interest in the person's world without judgment. Tolerance for ambiguity, comfort not knowing while still providing enough structure to hold the clinical space. Awareness of the family of origin influence, the ongoing self-reflection that keeps you from enacting your history in someone else's family. Integration of scholarship with practice, the practitioner-scholar ethic, and the cultural humility, not a checklist of cultural competencies, but an ongoing stance of learning, questioning your assumptions, and centering the client's experience of their own culture. So the science of couples counseling, the three dominant models, which we introduced in the beginning in the intro. So one of the significant additions to the third edition of Bitter's textbook is the expanded treatment of the couples counseling, including 3 standalone chapters on the models that currently dominate the field. Even though these models will be explored in depth later on in this course, in this class, they appear briefly in Chapter 2's 4th genogram, the evidence-based models, and it's worth orienting to them now. So the Gottman's Sound Relationship House. John and Julie Schwartz Gottman have been studying couples in conflict since the 1970s. First at the University of Illinois and later at the University of Washington, where they famously conducted psychophysiological studies of couples discussing conflict wearing heart monitors. Over 45 years of longitudinal research, they have identified what they call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for relationships, which are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. 4 communication patterns that predict divorce with striking accuracy, with contempt being the strongest single predictor. Their sound relationship house model organizes relationship health across 7 levels: love maps, fondness, and admiration, turning toward positive perspective, managing conflict, making life dreams come true, and creating shared meaning, with trust and commitment forming the load-bearing walls. The Gottman Institute in Seattle translates this research directly into clinical training and intervention. So along that comes Emotionally Focused Therapy by Susan Johnson. So Susan Johnson's emotionally focused therapy grounds its theory in attachment science, specifically in the work of John Bowlby, and in the neuroscience of bonding documented by Stephen Porges. So EFT understands couples distress as disruption in the attachment bond between partners. One or both partners feel emotionally unsafe, and their bids for connection are being missed or misread. Counseling moves through 3 stages: de-escalation, distress cycle, restructuring the attachment bond, and consolidating the new patterns of secure connection. And lastly, we have Hendricks and Hunt with the Imago Relationship Therapy. So Harville Hendricks and Helen LaKelly Hunt built Imago therapy on the provocative observation that unconsciously that we select partners who resemble in significant ways the people with whom we have unfinished emotional business from childhood. The partner activates our earliest wounds and therefore unfinished emotional business from childhood. The partner activates Sorry, I'll jump ahead here. So the imago therapy uses highly structured dialogue processes, mirroring, validating, and emphasizing to help couples move from reactivity to genuine connection, with the shared vision of marriage as a path to wholeness. All right, so a little bit of the vocabulary. Um, Before we kind of dive into the multicultural considerations and discussion questions, let me consolidate the vocabulary from these three chapters. These are the terms that we will encounter repeatedly through the class and throughout your clinical careers. Work with family and couples counseling, and precision in using them matters. So, differentiation of self. Bowen's cornerstone concept, the capacity to maintain a separate psychological identity while genuine emotional contact with others. The more differentiated, the less reactive. So that's Bowen again. Triangulation, that's when tension in the dyad draws a third person to stabilize the system. Chronic triangulation, especially of children, is one of the most common and damaging patterns in family life. Equifinality, von Bertalanffy's term for capacity of open living systems to react the same end through multiple different pathways. Families can be healthy in many different ways. There is no single template. Circular causality, mutual recursive influence among system elements, replaces the linear blame-oriented model of cause and effect. Then we have homeostasis. So a family system tendency to maintain its current state. Negative feedback loops resist change. Positive feedbacks promote it. Neither is inherently good or bad. And we have externalization. The narrative therapy move of separating the problem from person's identity. The problem is the problem, the person is not the problem. Enmeshment. So Minuchin's term for diffuse boundaries between subsystems. Over-involvement that erodes individual autonomy and effective subsystem functioning. Then we have congruence, another one of Satir's ideals for authentic alignment between inner experience, feelings, and outer expression, words and body aligned with what is genuinely felt. The metacommunication. So communication about communication. The implicit directive, often nonverbal, that tells the receiver how to interpret the content of a message. Resiliency. The capacity to recover, heal, and grow in the face of adversity. The strength-based reframe that has shifted the family counseling from pathology focus to a resource focus. Social constructionism. The epistemological position that the knowledge and stories are constructed in the language and relationship. There is no single objective family reality waiting to be discovered. There are multiple perspectives, each valid within its own context. And now we have the double bind, so the no-win situation, the no-escape communication pattern. The foundational concept linking family communication to schizophrenic processes and launching the field of systemic family research. All right, so binding down here, but leaving us with diversity and intersectionality in systemic practice. So we're going to go back to a little bit of the Bronfenbrenner's model here to understand this framework a little bit better. But the multicultural and gender considerations are not supplementary model in family counseling. They are constitutive of the entire enterprise. So as Monica McGoldrick and Ken Hardy argue, race, culture, and gender are not lenses we added to the clinical work. They are lenses through which all clinical work already occurs, whether we acknowledge it or not. So race and ethnicity. So again, looking at that Bronfenbrenner's microsystems or the macro system reminds us that race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status are not background variables. They are ongoing shaping forces on the family development. The research that Bitters cites is sobering. African American and Hispanic families are disproportionately affected by poverty and structural inequality and shapes the clinical picture in ways that the individual and family pathology frameworks cannot adequately address. Immigrant families, as we noted earlier, often show remarkable resilience, but they also carry weight of discrimination, displacement, acculturation stress, and interrupted generational continuity. And then we have gender. So the feminist critique has permanently established that systemic neutrality can be de facto endorsement of patriarchal norms. When a family counselor refuses to take a position of domestic violence because both parties contribute to the system, that is not neutrality. It is complicity. And Virginia Goldner's work in the mid 1980s and 90s was pivotal in forcing the field to acknowledge that gender issues were not peripheral to the systemic work but central to it. So today, gender role analysis and power assessments are understood as core components of the comprehensive family assessment. All right, so sexual orientation and family norm. So 2 decades of rigorous research have now established what Bitter states clearly. Children raised by gay or lesbian parents develop comparably to those raised by heterosexual parents. Lesbian couples in particular tend to show more equitable division of household labor and higher levels of parental involvement than heterosexual couples. The clinical implication is direct, and expanding definitions of the family require expanding frameworks for assessment. So any model that implicitly assumes a heterosexual nuclear family as the template for a health is just culturally limiting. It is empirically unsupported. Culture, collectivism, and the system's perspective. So finally, Bitter points out something that should give the Western trained clinicians some pause. The system's perspectives that we treat as clinical innovation is simply a cultural norm in many collectivist societies. In Asian, African, and indigenous cultures, interdependence, multi-generational responsibility, and hierarchical family structures are not just pathologies to be restructured. They are the relational context in which health and identity are defined. Cultural humility requires that we examine the assumptions continually, not achieve a level of cultural competence and consider the matter settled. All right, so truly winding down here, we're going to end with some discussion questions. So we close with 5 discussion questions designated for doctoral level engagement, but truly at any level. I'll read each one, give you a moment to reflect, and sit with your thoughts as I ask the questions. There are no clean answers to any of these, which is precisely the point. So question 1. It's the ontological challenge here. Bitter argues that a system's perspective runs directly against Western values of individualism and autonomy. How might a practitioner reconcile this epistemological tension with clients who hold deeply individualistic worldviews? Is the goal to shift the client's worldview, to work within it, or to hold both simultaneously? Question 2. The therapist differentiation. So both Bitter and Bowen argue that the practitioner's own level of differentiation directly affects the clinical outcomes. What ethical and professional obligations does this create for even just doctoral training programs and for supervision? Should a practitioner's family of origin work be required for licensure or to complete a program? Who holds practitioners accountable for their own ongoing development? Question 3. First versus second order change. How does Batson's distinction between first order and second order change inform treatment planning? Can you construct a clinical example where superficial change, excuse me, the family doing something different without the underlying system transforming, might be misidentified as therapeutic process? What clinical markers help us distinguish genuine second order change from homeostatic adjustment? Question 4. Feminist systems integration. The feminist critique challenges systemic neutrality as a form of patriarchal complicity. Social constructionists and narrative therapists responding by adapting a not-knowing, decentered position, but to what extent is the not-knowing position itself a form of power? The power to withhold one's perspective? Can feminist values and postmodern epistemology coexist coherently, or do they pull in opposite directions? Question 5. Evidence-based practice tension. So the Gottman, Johnson, and Hendricks-Hunt models all claim to be evidence-based status. Critically evaluate what evidence means in relational counseling. What are the epistemological and ethical limitations of applying randomized controlled trial standards to the assessment of systemic interventions? Are there forms of clinical evidence, qualitative, phenomenological, narrative, that are being systemically excluded from the conversation? And here are the references basically that were brought up within these chapters.